The first shot rang out in the dead of night, shattering the eerie silence of the mountain town, and with it, the fragile sense of safety Margaret Kane had built since her husband's death. Margaret, a 32-year-old widow, had learned early that survival depended on both grit and cunning. Her ash-brown hair, streaked with silver, framed a face hardened by loss but softened by compassion. Her cabin perched at the edge of the forest, a solitary structure of timber and stone, stood as a beacon of independence in a region where winter had claimed more lives than law ever could. Tonight, however, even her sanctuary felt fragile. Outside, the wind sliced through the pines, carrying with it the scent of snow and a sense of foreboding she could not shake. She was organizing supplies by the fireplace when the second shot rang out, closer this time. It hit the timber of her cabin with a sharp crack. Margaret ducked instinctively behind the counter of her trading post, her pulse hammering in her ears. Footsteps in the snow approached, deliberate and heavy. Whoever they were coming for her. Suddenly, the door burst open, and a figure tumbled across the threshold. He was tall, his broad frame hunched from injury, his long black hair streaked with soot and snow clinging to his face. Blood stained the front of his wool coat, and deep gashes marred his arms and shoulders. Around his neck hung a set of tribal jewelry, an intricate necklace and matching armbands glinting in the dim light. His eyes, dark and piercing, flicked up at Margaret, revealing both pain and desperation. "Help! Me," he rasped, collapsing behind the counter. Margaret's hands shook as she tore strips from an old blanket and tied them around the gaping wounds on his arms. "Who did this to you?" she demanded, her voice sharp with a mixture of fear and anger. He shook his head, groaning. "No time. They're coming." "You can't let them find me." Margaret's mind raced. She had survived bandits, brutal winters, and loss, but never had her sanctuary been breached in such a way. She realized her quiet life was over. The night had brought with it danger, secrets, and a man whose presence threatened to unravel everything she had fought to protect. The storm outside worsened, snow pounding against the windows and rattling the roof. Margaret fetched water and a knife from the counter, helping the man who finally whispered his name. Elias Blackthorn leaned against the wall. He shivered violently, half from the cold, half from shock. His dark eyes met hers, and in that gaze, she saw not only pain but a story she would need to uncover to survive the coming nights. He attacked me for something I carry," Elias said, clutching a blood-stained envelope. "Something dangerous and deadly." Margaret's heart sank. The forest had always been a place of refuge, but now it seemed alive with threats, both human and otherwise. Her mind flicked back to the nights after her husband's death, when she had wandered these woods alone, relying on her instincts to stay alive. Now, instinct alone would not be enough. A sudden noise at the back of the cabin, a scraping of metal on wood, made her freeze. Her hand went to the rifle her late husband had left above the fireplace. Outside, shadows moved across the snow, distorted by the dim glow of the lanterns inside. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Whoever had attacked Elias was still searching, and they were close. "We can't stay here," Elias said, his voice hoarse but urgent. "They'll come through the doors, the windows. They'll tear this place apart to get me." Margaret nodded, her mind racing. She grabbed her winter coat, thick gloves, and a hat while helping Elias to his feet. Despite his injuries, his grip on her arm was surprisingly strong, his determination palpable. The two slipped into the night, moving through knee-deep snow, the icy air biting through their clothing. Branches clawed at their faces, and the snow muffled their footsteps, offering both concealment and danger. Each step through the forest felt treacherous, the ground uneven, the frozen river treacherous, the trees casting long, skeletal shadows in the pale moonlight. Margaret's heart pounded, her senses sharpened to every sound. the distant howl of a wolf, the cracking of ice underfoot, the faint whisper of someone following them. They reached an abandoned log cabin Elias had discovered months earlier while scouting the forest. The structure was small, with a sagging roof and windows cracked with frost. Inside, dust and snow had settled on the floorboards, but it offered shelter from the storm. Margaret set Elias down near the fireplace, lighting a small flame to chase away the chill. As Elias rested, Margaret examined the envelope he had been clutching so tightly. It was thick and stained with blood, its contents hidden from view. "What is this?" she asked, keeping her voice low. "Proof," Elias said. "Proof of crimes so severe the men who orchestrated them would kill without hesitation. Bribery, murder, land theft. Corruption that runs through Crowsbend like a sickness. I was delivering it to someone who could expose them, but—" He trailed off, wincing in pain. Margaret felt a shiver of fear and resolve. She had survived the death of her husband, bandits, and isolation, but she had never faced something this dangerous. For the first time in years, the forest around her felt alive with menace. A trap waiting to close around her and Elias. They spent the night fortifying the cabin as best they could. Margaret dragged fallen branches against the windows, piling snow against the door. She fashioned crude alarm strings of tin cans strung across the threshold, meant to warn them if someone tried to enter. Elias, though weakened, helped where he could, tying splints around his arms and sharpening a hunting knife with trembling precision. By dawn, exhaustion had overtaken fear. Margaret sat by the fire, staring at the man who had crashed into her life mere hours ago. He was silent now, his breathing shallow, eyes closed as if the night had drained all strength from him. Yet, despite his injuries, there was a spark in him, a stubbornness that mirrored her own. Margaret reflected on her own past, remembering the winter after her husband had been killed by a greedy cattle baron. She had wandered the forest alone for days, surviving only on what she could hunt and the small supply of food left in the cabin. She had thought she was ready for anything, but Elias's arrival reminded her that danger often found you when you least expected it. Hours passed. Snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the forest in white, muffling sounds and hiding tracks. Margaret's thoughts drifted to the town of Crowsbend, a place she had avoided for years, steeped in corruption and greed. Elias's words had planted a seed of dread. If what he carried was true, those men would stop at nothing to retrieve it. And now, Margaret realized, she was part of a story far larger and more dangerous than her solitary life had ever been. Elias stirred, groaning softly. Margaret handed him water, her hands brushing against his, feeling the tension of his muscles beneath the thin layer of clothing. "You need to rest," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "We'll figure this out." "No time," he whispered, struggling to sit upright. "They'll keep coming. You have to be ready." Margaret's pulse quickened. She had survived snowstorms, wolves, and violent men before, but nothing like this. The thought of being hunted, trapped, and responsible for someone else's life ignited a fierce determination inside her. She would not fail, not now. Not when she had finally begun to reclaim her life. The forest outside remained silent for a moment, deceptively calm. Then, from somewhere in the distance, the faint echo of hooves reached her ears, muffled by snow yet unmistakable. Margaret gripped her rifle, scanning the horizon through the frost-covered window. Elias's eyes met hers, dark and unwavering. And she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The first day of their flight had begun, and the winter woods of the Old West had already revealed themselves as both a sanctuary and a cage. Margaret understood, with a sinking certainty, that the snow-covered forest would not merely protect them, it would test them, push them to their limits, and demand that they confront dangers far greater than either had imagined. As the sun rose over the treetops, glinting off the snow like shattered glass. Margaret tightened her scarf around her neck and checked her rifle. Elias's hand brushed against hers, a silent gesture of trust and shared resolve. She had survived so much already, yet the journey ahead promised trials more harrowing than any she had faced. And deep in her chest, Margaret felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in years' anticipation, danger, and the stirring of hope that together they might just survive. Margaret had barely slept when the first pale light of dawn seeped through the frost-cracked windows of the abandoned cabin. The air inside was still heavy with the scent of smoke and blood, and she could hear the soft, uneven breathing of Elias as he shifted against the makeshift bedding she had arranged. Her muscles ached from hours spent tending to his wounds, barricading doors, and keeping a vigil through the long, frozen night. Outside, the snow pressed relentlessly against the cabin walls, a silent and oppressive reminder of the isolation that surrounded them. Elias stirred, blinking through the pain and frost that clung to his eyelashes. His voice, when it came, was low and raspy, yet firm. "We need to move soon. They'll search the forest. They always do. They know every trail." Margaret nodded, though her body screamed for rest. "We can't stay here forever," she said, her hands automatically checking the weapons she had gathered, the rifle her husband had left, a hunting knife with a dark wooden handle, and a pair of revolvers hidden in her coat. Every movement reminded her that survival was no longer a choice, it was a necessity. Together, they packed what little supplies they had salvaged from the cabin. Elias's envelope was carefully tucked into Margaret's satchel, wrapped in cloth to protect it from snow and moisture. Each step outside was a battle against the biting wind, the snow crunching beneath their boots, masking their movements even as it slowed them. The forest, beautiful in its silent white expanse, was now a labyrinth of danger. Every tree could hide a pursuer. Every shadow might conceal death. As they trudged through the snow-laden pines, Elias explained more of what had happened. He had been delivering documents that proved the town of Krausbend's wealthiest and most influential men were not only corrupt but deadly. Murder, land theft, bribery, they had covered their crimes for years, but Elias had evidence that could bring them down. That evidence had painted a target on his back, and now, with Margaret unwittingly caught in the middle, the danger was multiplied. Margaret's mind raced. She had expected solitude when she retreated to the forest after her husband's death. She had survived harsh winters, bandits, and hunger, but the weight of responsibility for someone else's life and for justice itself was heavier than she had imagined. She glanced at Elias as he stumbled slightly over a fallen branch, grimacing in pain. His injuries were severe, and yet his determination burned bright. She had never encountered someone so steadfast in the face of such imminent danger. By mid-morning, they reached a shallow valley where the snow had piled high against the trunks of ancient pines. The sound of running water reached them faintly beneath the ice, a partially frozen creek that could provide both water and cover. Margaret knelt by the stream, cupping her hands to drink the icy water, and Elias followed, leaning heavily on her shoulder. For a brief moment they shared silence, broken only by the gentle gurgle of water beneath the ice, and the distant caw of a crow circling the treetops, but the peace was fleeting. From the ridgeline above they spotted movement, shadows flitting between trees, shapes that moved too deliberately to be wildlife. Margaret's heart lurched. She motioned for Elias to crouch behind a snowbank. Drawing her rifle, she peered through the scope, her breath fogging in the cold morning air. 5 figures emerged masked, mounted on dark horses, rifles glinting in the weak sunlight. They were the same hunters who had ambushed Elias the night before. "They're testing us," Elias whispered, his voice strained. "They're not leaving until they find the envelope." Margaret's grip on her rifle tightened. Her mind raced as she calculated their odds. They were outnumbered, wounded, and exposed, but the forest could be their ally. She pointed to a narrow, snow-choked ravine leading into denser woods. If we move fast, we can lose them among the pines. The trees will hide us. Elias nodded, forcing a grim smile. Lead the way. They moved swiftly, slipping into the thickening forest. Margaret's boots sank deep into the powdery snow, branches tearing at her coat, but she kept her pace steady. Elias, despite his injuries, kept close, his hand occasionally brushing against hers to maintain balance. The hunters followed at a distance, careful not to overcommit, their presence a constant, suffocating pressure. Hours passed. The snowstorm that had held off overnight returned with a vengeance, thick flakes swirling around them, reducing visibility to mere feet. The forest became a maze of white and shadow. Margaret and Elias slowed, taking shelter under the overhang of a fallen pine. Elias winced as he pressed his palm to the splint on his arm, and Margaret worked quickly, adjusting the bindings to prevent further injury. "We need a plan," Elias murmured, his teeth chattering from the cold. "We can't keep running blindly. They'll follow until they corner us, or worse, we'll stumble into a trap." Margaret's eyes scanned the area. A ridge loomed to their left, its snow-slicked slope steep but navigable. "We use the ridge," she said. "If we can get higher ground, we can see them coming and maybe turn the tables. The snow and trees will help us set traps if we have to fight." Elias considered it, then nodded reluctantly. "Lead the way. But be careful, the cold will sap your strength faster than any gun." The climb was brutal. Snow clung to their clothes and hair, their breath forming clouds in the icy air. Margaret's muscles burned with exertion, but she refused to falter. Elias leaned heavily on her arm, his dark hair matted with frost, tribal jewelry glinting faintly against the snow. As they reached the top, Margaret's heart pounded with anticipation and fear. Below them, the hunters had paused, scanning the woods. Unaware that their prey had gained the advantage, Margaret's eyes caught sight of a fallen log in a patch of ice-covered ground. An idea formed. "We can lure them here," she whispered. "They won't expect the ice to hold their weight." Elias raised an eyebrow, impressed despite his pain. "You've thought of a trap?" "I've survived winters and wolves," Margaret said. "A few hunters won't scare me. But we have to act carefully." They worked quickly, setting crude markers and testing the ice's strength. The hunters, growing impatient, began to advance, their movements slower now, cautious. Margaret and Elias waited, hearts hammering, the cold gnawing at their fingers and toes. When the hunters stepped onto the ice, the surface groaned ominously. Margaret held her breath, watching as the first horse slipped, crashing into the icy water below. Panic spread among the remaining men, and they hesitated, unsure of the terrain. One by one, they tested the ice, and one by one, the surface betrayed them. The sounds of splintering ice and shouts echoed through the forest, mixing with the wind and snow in a symphony of chaos. Margaret and Elias watched from the ridge, adrenaline coursing through their veins. Elias's hand brushed hers, a silent acknowledgement of trust, relief, and shared victory. The hunters who had terrorized them were temporarily neutralized, and for the first time in days, a measure of control returned to their lives. As the snowstorm began to wane, they descended carefully into the ravine, checking their surroundings. The valley below, now littered with broken branches and partially submerged horses, was a grisly reminder of the dangers they faced. Margaret's stomach churned, but she forced herself to focus. They had survived, but the fight was far from over. By evening, they reached a narrow frozen creek that would serve as a natural barrier against further pursuit. Margaret broke through the ice to gather water while Elias rested, his breathing shallow but steady. She studied his face in the fading light, the pain etched in his features. the determination in his eyes, and realized how deeply she had come to rely on him, not just for survival, but as a partner in a battle neither of them had expected to fight. Margaret and Elias huddled near the creek, the fire she managed to coax into life casting flickering shadows across the snow. They shared silence and warmth, the kind of quiet companionship that comes only when lives are intertwined by danger. Elias finally spoke, voice low and pained. "We need a safe place to rest, somewhere no one will find us for days." Margaret nodded. "I know a mining town, abandoned, not far from here. It's off the main trails and the buildings are solid. We can rest, plan, and maybe figure out how to get this evidence to someone who can use it." Elias's eyes softened with gratitude, though the pain in his body was evident. "Lead the way. I trust you." As night fell, snow blanketed the forest once more, muting all sound except for the distant howl of a wolf and the crackling of their fire. Margaret felt a flicker of hope amidst the exhaustion and fear. They had survived the night, outwitted their pursuers, and were still alive. The forest, once a place of isolation and hardship, had become a refuge, a place where, despite danger, they could breathe and plan. Margaret understood that the days ahead would be even more treacherous. They would face not just the hunters but the powerful men behind Elias's ambush. But for the first time in days, she allowed herself a moment of calm, the snow swirling around them like a blanket of possibility. She and Elias were alive together, and for now, that was enough. The winter forest held its breath around them, silent and indifferent, as if acknowledging the fragile, fleeting victory. Margaret's gaze met Elias's across the firelight, a solemn promise passing between them. No matter the danger, no matter the odds, they would face it together. The next morning, Margaret and Elias moved cautiously through the dense forest, leaving behind the frozen creek and the chaos of their earlier trap. The snow was deep, and their footprints trailed behind them like a breadcrumb path of desperation. Each step was deliberate. The cold bit at their faces, their fingers numb despite the thick gloves Margaret had forced herself to keep on. Elias moved slowly, every movement careful to avoid aggravating his injuries. He leaned heavily on Margaret, murmuring thanks as they went. Though the words were muffled by the wind, their destination was the abandoned mining town. Margaret had mentioned a forgotten cluster of wooden buildings half swallowed by snow, with rusted roofs and sagging porches. She had stumbled upon it years ago while scavenging during a particularly harsh winter, and it had always seemed like a place where one could hide from the world. Now, it promised not only shelter but the chance to plan their next move against those who hunted. Elias. The path to the town was treacherous. Snowdrifts concealed hidden depressions, frozen streams threatened to break underfoot, and the wind carried a sharp, biting edge. Margaret led Elias along a narrow ridge, her sharp eyes scanning every shadow, every distant movement. Occasionally, the branches of pines would sway unnaturally, and she would freeze, listening for any sign of pursuit. The memory of the hunters falling through the ice yesterday lingered, but she knew others might still be searching for them. Cautious and relentless, after hours of grueling travel, they crested a low hill and saw the town spread below them, half buried in snow. Margaret's breath caught in her throat, not from fear this time, but from the stark beauty of it. The buildings were skeletal reminders of a forgotten era, a church with broken stained glass, a saloon with a crooked sign swinging in the wind, and several cabins that had been long abandoned. Snow covered everything in a quiet white blanket, erasing traces of life and leaving the town in a haunting stillness. Elias gave a weak smile, though it quickly faded into a grimace of pain. "I've never seen a place like this," he said, leaning on her arm. "It feels frozen in time." Margaret helped him down the slope carefully. "It's perfect for hiding," she said. "No one comes here anymore. We can rest, plan, and stay ahead of anyone looking for you." They reached the saloon first, the largest building in the town. Margaret pushed open the warped double doors, revealing a space thick with dust, broken bottles, and tattered remnants of tables and chairs. The floorboards creaked under their weight, and the faint smell of old whiskey and decay filled their noses. Margaret scanned every corner, rifle at the ready, before nodding to Elias to follow her to the back room where a collapsed wall offered some insulation from the wind. Once inside, Margaret helped Elias sit against a wall, wrapping him in blankets she had carried. His dark eyes met hers, filled with both gratitude and exhaustion. Margaret knelt beside him, unpacking the envelope he had brought, careful to keep the documents hidden and dry. Each sheet detailed crimes that made her stomach turn: bribery, murder, land theft, and intimidation, all sanctioned by men whose names were revered in Crow's Bend. The depth of corruption was staggering. This is worse than I thought," Margaret whispered, her fingers brushing against the edges of the papers. "If what's written here is true, they'll stop at nothing to get it back." Elias nodded, wincing as he shifted slightly. "They'll come after me. And now, after you too. You've been caught in this whether you like it or not. But there's no going back. These people, they can't be allowed to continue." Margaret swallowed hard, feeling the weight of responsibility settle onto her shoulders. She had survived loss, bandits, and the harsh wilderness, but this was something larger, more dangerous. It wasn't just about survival now, it was about justice, and about ensuring that the lives destroyed by these men were remembered. The day passed slowly. Margaret cleaned and dressed Elias's wounds as best she could with the limited supplies they had, and they shared a sparse meal from what little food remained in their packs. They spoke little, each lost in thought, but there was an unspoken bond forming between them, a trust forged in fire and snow, in blood and fear. Margaret realized that in all her years of solitude, she had never depended on anyone as she depended on Elias now. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows over the abandoned town, Margaret and Elias sat near a small fire she managed to start in the corner of the saloon. The flickering flames illuminated the lines of pain and determination etched into Elias's face, and Margaret felt a surge of protective instinct. "We'll need a plan for the next step," she said, breaking the silence. "If they know you're alive, they'll come again. And next time, they might bring more than 5 men." Elias nodded. "I've been thinking about that. We need to find someone who can testify, someone alive who knows what these men have done. Otherwise, this will just be paper in the snow." Margaret frowned, her mind racing through possibilities. The nearest town, Crow's Bend, was the heart of the corruption. Approaching anyone there was too dangerous. But the mining town, though abandoned, gave them time to strategize. Margaret began drawing rough maps in the snow outside, outlining paths, potential traps, and hiding spots. Elias watched, his hand resting lightly on hers as they traced the routes. For the first time since the night he had crashed into her cabin, he felt a flicker of hope. Night deepened, and the temperature plummeted. The wind howled outside, rattling the broken windows, and snow seeped through gaps in the walls. Margaret huddled close to Elias, checking his pulse and warmth. "We'll make it through this," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was reassuring him or herself. "We've survived worse, haven't we?" Elias smiled faintly, the gesture weak but genuine. "Yes, but not like this. Not together." They sat in silence for a long while, listening to the storm outside, feeling the oppressive weight of the forest around them. Yet within that weight was a strange comfort. They were alive. They had survived the ambush, the hunters, and the frozen wilderness. And now, though battered and weary, they had a place to regroup, a chance to prepare for what would come next. Margaret's mind drifted back to her husband. to the solitude she had embraced after his death. She had built a life of quiet survival, believing that she could handle anything on her own. But now, with Elias beside her, she understood something she hadn't known before. Survival was one thing, but fighting for justice and fighting alongside someone you trust was a different kind of strength altogether. The hours passed slowly. They took turns resting, Margaret keeping watch, ears straining for any sign of movement outside. The forest beyond the town remained silent, but Margaret knew it was a silence that could not be trusted. The hunters may have fallen through the ice, but others would be coming. And yet, for the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe, to plan, and to feel a flicker of hope. Elias shifted beside her, groaning softly. "Margaret." "Thank you," he murmured, "for helping me, for trusting me. I don't know how I survived the past 2 days without you." Margaret's eyes softened. "You would have done the same for me," she replied. "We're in this together now, and we'll see it through whatever it takes." Outside, the snow continued to fall, settling over the abandoned mining town in a thick, muffling blanket. The silence was deceptive as always, but within the saloon, the small fire crackled and danced, illuminating the faces of two people bound by circumstance, courage, and the raw, unyielding will to survive. They spoke little after that, conserving energy, tending to wounds, and planning their next steps in whispers. The envelope remained hidden, a silent promise of justice that neither could yet fully act upon. But as the night deepened, the bond between them grew stronger, forged in shared danger and quiet determination. When dawn finally approached, painting the sky in pale hues of pink and gold, Margaret and Elias were awake again, ready to continue their journey. The forest awaited them, harsh and beautiful, a labyrinth of snow and shadow. But they had survived the worst of the storm, and they had each other. That alone was a victory, and for now, it was enough to carry them forward. Margaret glanced at Elias, noting the grim set of his jaw, the fatigue in his posture, and the quiet resilience in his dark eyes. She realized that in the days to come, they would need every ounce of strength, cunning, and courage they possessed. The forest was vast, the hunters relentless, and the corruption in Crowsbend deep-rooted. But together, they had survived the night. Together they would face whatever came next, and in that moment, amidst the snow and silence, Margaret understood something essential. She was no longer alone, and survival was no longer the only thing that mattered. The fight for justice and for their own lives had only just begun. The night had passed quietly, unusually so, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Margaret sat near the dying embers of the fire in the abandoned saloon, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of barely warm water. Elias, his injuries slowly healing under her careful attention, leaned against the wall, staring into the shadows with eyes sharp despite exhaustion. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the mining town under a pristine, blinding blanket of white. For the first time in days, the world felt still, but Margaret knew better. Danger was never far behind, and the hunters, though defeated, were only part of the threat. The men who had orchestrated Elias's ambush in Crowsbend remained at large, and their power was not to be underestimated. Margaret unrolled a small map she had traced in the snow the day before, detailing routes, ridges, and paths through the forest. Her finger lingered over the town of Crowsbend. "We have to go there," she said quietly. "We can't let them continue. Not after everything we've seen." Elias winced as he shifted, testing the strength of his arm. "You really want to walk into their lair?" His tone carried more concern than disbelief. "Margaret, these are men who have killed without hesitation. They've controlled the town for years." "I know," she replied, her voice firm. "And now we have a chance to stop them. I won't let their violence reach anyone else." Not you, not me, not anyone else who suffered because of them. Elias's dark eyes softened as he studied her face, noticing the determination that mirrored his own. "You've changed since last night," he said. "You were survival itself, but now, you're justice." Margaret allowed herself a brief smile, though she knew the weight of what lay ahead. They packed their meager supplies, wrapped Elias's wounds once more, and moved cautiously toward the forest's edge. The snow crunched beneath their boots, and the occasional snap of a branch made them pause, alert to every sound. Even in daylight, the forest was a trap, full of hidden dangers and unseen eyes dot by midday. They reached a frozen stream that led down to a narrow pass into Crow's Bend. Margaret paused at the top, scanning the town from a distance. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, a stark contrast to the pristine snow, and the streets below were bustling with townsfolk unaware of the corruption that pulsed at the town's heart. The sheriff, a man whose public face was polished and trustworthy, would be their first obstacle or their first opportunity. Elias adjusted the satchel containing the evidence. "We need a plan," he said. "The sheriff can't be trusted to act alone, and the townsfolk. They've been intimidated for too long. We need witnesses. Someone willing to testify." Margaret nodded, her mind racing. "We start with the sheriff," she said. "He's the only one with authority. If he sees the proof and realizes we're serious, he can't ignore it. But we have to make him act quickly before the men behind this find out we're here." The descent into the town was slow and deliberate. Margaret led the way, her eyes scanning every window, every alley, every shadow that might conceal a threat. Elias followed closely, leaning on her for support, but his posture carried quiet strength. They moved as one, a team forged through snow, blood, and fear. They reached the sheriff's office, a modest wooden building with a single lantern flickering in the window. Margaret pushed open the door, and they were greeted by the warm smell of burning wood and ink. Sheriff Alden, a man of medium build with graying hair and a face that had always seemed kind, looked up from his desk, startled by their sudden appearance. "Can I help you?" he asked, though the tension in his voice betrayed his surprise. Margaret stepped forward, holding out the satchel. "I think you need to see this." She set it on the desk carefully, unwrapping the documents to reveal the detailed proof of corruption, murder, and land theft. Elias stood beside her, his presence silent but commanding, his gaze steady on the sheriff. Alden's eyes widened as he scanned the papers, his hands trembling slightly. This is... He paused, swallowing hard. "If this is true, if these men are responsible..." Margaret's voice was calm, firm. "It's true, and they'll stop at nothing to cover it up. They tried to kill Elias. They tried to kill me. They've ruled this town for too long." The sheriff set the papers down, his face pale. I need to confirm this is explosive. I can't just act alone." Elias stepped forward, voice steady but filled with emotion. "You're not acting alone. We've risked everything to get this to you. You've seen it. Now you can't ignore it. If you hesitate, more people will die, and these men will continue to destroy lives." Alden's hands clenched the edge of his desk. "You're right," he said finally. "I've been complicit by doing nothing. I can't allow that anymore." He motioned to the door. "Deputies, secure the town. Block all exits. We're bringing these men in, starting with the council. No one leaves until this is resolved." Margaret exhaled, relief mixing with lingering tension. The storm of fear and uncertainty that had followed them for days seemed to lift slightly. Outside, the townsfolk gathered, their curiosity piqued, the town suddenly alive with whispered rumors. Some watched in awe, others in fear. As Sheriff Alden and his deputies moved through the streets with purpose, the corrupt men, Those who had wielded power through intimidation and murder tried to resist, but the combination of irrefutable evidence, Elias's testimony, and Margaret's unwavering presence left them no room to maneuver. Arrests were made swiftly. Some men pleaded, some threatened, but the law finally backed by courage and truth prevailed. Margaret and Elias watched from the sheriff's office window as the last of the men were led away in handcuffs, their faces twisted with disbelief and rage. The townsfolk, many of whom had suffered silently under their rule, whispered in relief and amazement. The air of fear that had gripped Crow's Bend for decades was beginning to lift, replaced by a cautious but palpable sense of justice. Elias let out a long breath, his shoulders slumping in exhaustion. "It's over," he said, almost in disbelief. Finally. Margaret turned to him, eyes glistening. "No," she said softly. "It's not over. It's just the beginning. But we've done what we came here to do. We've survived. And we've made sure they can't hurt anyone else." Elias reached for her hand, and for the first time since the ambush, he allowed himself to relax. "I couldn't have done it without you," he admitted, voice quiet. "You saved me. More than once. You've been my strength when I had none." Margaret's lips curved into a faint smile. "And you've been mine. Together we made it through the worst." She looked out the window at the snow-covered streets, now filled with life and cautious optimism. "The town will recover, and we get to choose what comes next." For a moment, they simply stood together, hand in hand, the cold wind blowing through the open window, brushing against their faces. The storm outside had passed, leaving the town, the forest, and themselves in a fragile calm. Margaret felt a sense of closure, a rare peace that had eluded her for years since her husband's death. Later that evening, as the sun set behind the ridges surrounding Crow's Bend, Margaret and Elias walked through the town streets. The townsfolk watched them, some with gratitude, some with curiosity. There was no celebration, no grand gesture, only a quiet acknowledgement that the balance of power had shifted, and that justice, long denied, had finally arrived. Margaret paused at the edge of the town, looking toward the forest beyond. The trees were dark and imposing, the snow glinting like shards of glass in the fading light. She drew a deep breath, feeling the cold air fill her lungs. Elias stood beside her, his presence steady and reassuring, the faint glint of his tribal jewelry catching the last rays of sun. "We survived," she said, almost to herself. "And we'll keep surviving. But now we live." Elias smiled, a small weary curve of his lips. Together, they turned back toward the heart of the town, toward warmth, shelter, and the uncertain but promising future that awaited them. The evidence had been delivered, the men had been arrested, and the town of Crow's Bend had been forced to reckon with its sins. Margaret and Elias had not only survived the wilderness, the hunters, and the storm, they had prevailed against fear, corruption, and death itself. That night, for the first time in weeks, they slept without the gnawing terror of pursuit, without the constant ache of cold and wounds. The fire in the saloon flickered softly, casting shadows that danced against the walls, and Margaret felt a rare sense of contentment. She and Elias had been tested beyond measure, and though their journey had been perilous, it had forged a bond stronger than either had anticipated. The snow continued to fall outside, gentle and silent, covering the scars of the past in a soft, unbroken white. In the quiet, Margaret allowed herself a final thought. The wilderness, the hunters, and the darkness of the Old West had challenged her to the very edge of survival. But she had endured. She had protected what mattered. And now, at last, she could look forward, not behind Dot, as dawn broke over Crow's Bend the following morning. Painting the snow in hues of gold and rose, Margaret and Elias walked side by side through the streets. The town was changing, slowly but irrevocably, and they were part of that change. The trials they had endured had shaped them, yes, but they had also prepared them for the life ahead. Margaret's eyes met Elias's, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to hope. Together, they stepped into it, leaving the shadows behind, moving forward into the light of a new beginning.